Hello everyone, welcome to the channel, and I am here for a list video for you guys. Now for this video, I'll be going over 10 overhated albums by great bands. Now before I start, I would just like to take a moment and acknowledge the newcomers to the channel and just say welcome to Zach D Productions, because I know some of you have subscribed because of Jamie Horsley, because of that collaboration video I did with him. So I just wanted to say thanks so much for all the new subscribers to the channel. I hope you enjoy the content here, and feel free to leave comments on the videos as well, and I'll do my best to reply to them. If I can't reply to them, or if I have nothing to say about them, I'll at least leave your comment a like, of course. That's usually how I roll here. So I realize that I've already done a list video like this before, but I figured that it would be interesting to do an updated version of this particular list video. So yeah, in my opinion, I do think these albums are overhated. I don't think that these albums are as bad as a lot of people make them out to be. And I also think these albums are pretty underrated too. So this list is in no particular order, by the way. Let's go ahead and get started. So I think we'll start off with Metallica and their album Death Magnetic. I've seen some people, when it comes to their Metallica rankings, put this closer to the bottom of their ranking. I've even seen some people go as far to say that this is one of the worst metal albums of all time, which, I mean, come on, guys, that's a little pushing it, I think. That is pushing it big time. But, yeah, this album, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be. I mean, yeah, it's not one of their best, but I think it's still pretty good. And, yeah, the production, not the greatest. I mean, it's got pretty crappy production, but there is some good stuff on here, like End of the Line, The Day That Never Comes, which I know some people don't like that song, but I mean, come on. That solo that's at the end of the song, really good stuff. You also got All Nightmare Long and The Unforgiven Part 3. Now, out of all three Unforgiven tracks from Metallica, I would say that this one is my least favorite, but even in saying that, I still think this one is pretty good. But yeah, Death Magnetic by Metallica, not as bad as some people claim it to be. Like I said, yeah, it's not one of their best, but it's pretty good still. Next up, we got The X Factor by Iron Maiden. Of course, the first album with Blaze Bayley on vocals whenever Bruce left for a bit, who is their primary vocalist. And yeah, this album is good. Definitely not as bad as some people make it out to be. When it comes to some people's Iron Maiden rankings, I know that some people would put this close to the bottom. I know some people say you could easily pass up on the Blaze Bayley era, and that includes this album too. I mean, Virtual 11 is not that great of an album, but this one is actually pretty good. I do think this is the best of Blaze Bayley's era with Iron Maiden. There is some good stuff on here, like Sign of the Cross, Lord of the Flies, Man on the Edge, The Edge of Darkness, Judgment of Heaven, 2 AM, and The Unbeliever. These are all solid tracks. And this album, I do think, is one of Iron Maiden's most dark-sounding albums, which is pretty cool. Yeah, you definitely get a dark atmosphere in this album, which is pretty cool. So, yeah, definitely a good album. Pretty underrated, if you ask me. So, Iron Maiden, The X Factor. Next in the list, now I never really expected this one to make the list, but here it is. So next up we got Dream Theater with their album The Astonishing. And whenever I popped this album in, giving it a listen for the first time, I honestly was not expecting this album to be that great. Obviously due to what people have been saying, of course. Like, they say that this is the worst Dream Theater album, and this album is just totally boring or whatever. Now, yes, I would say that it's definitely nowhere near one of Dream Theater's best albums, and the whole complaint about it being boring is, I think, a little silly too, because there's some pretty good stuff on here. I mean, there's songs like The Gift of Music, A Better Life, A Life Left Behind, and Chosen. These are actually pretty good songs. Now, I would say that my main complaint with this album is there is way too much filler on this album, especially when it comes to the second disc on this double album. And I don't even know why they even had to make this a double album anyway. They could have just made it just a single album, like, because I mean, on the first disc you already got like what, 20 tracks. They could have just easily left it at that. I mean, the second disc really does feel so unnecessary and just full of filler, in my opinion anyway. Maybe the second disc will grow on me more as I give it more listens or whatever, but I don't know. I mean, it's not bad, but it is kind of filler if you ask me. The first disc though is pretty solid for the most part. But in general, I do think this album is overhated. Yes, it's not one of Dream Theater's best, but I mean, with Dream Theater, I mean, you can't go wrong with them. Definitely one of the greatest progressive metal bands of all time. But yeah, it's a pretty good album, I must say. Pretty overhated. Next in the list, we got Inside Out by Fate's Warning. Now, I've seen some people's rankings when it comes to Fate's Warning, and I've seen some people place this album rather close to the bottom, which I think is kind of ridiculous, in my opinion anyway. Pretty underrated album. There's a lot of great songs on here. Outside Looking In, Island in the Stream, Face the Fear, and Monument. These are all really great songs. Island in the Stream actually might be one of my favorite Fate's Warning songs. I think that song is just super underrated. I don't know how this song isn't getting more attention from Fate's Warning fans. I just really like the solo in that song. It maybe has one of my favorite Fate's Warning solos. I just really like the riffs and even the melody in this song. It's just fantastic. Yeah, really good song, and this album is actually really good. I mean, sure, it's not one of Fate's Warning's best, but it is a very solid album still. And I, of course, look forward to the new album that they have coming out pretty shortly now. But yeah, Fate's Warning, Inside Out. Next in the list is from the band Rush, one of my favorite bands and one of the greatest progressive rock bands of all time. And the album I am talking about here is Hold Your Fire, which I do think is underrated and overhated for sure. Like with Inside Out by Fate's Warning, this album here, when it comes to some people's rankings with Rush, there is some people that do have this close to the bottom, which I think is... I mean, I understand why, but I personally wouldn't put it at the bottom. I think it's actually a pretty solid album. I mean, there's a lot of great songs on here. Force 10, Time Stands Still. I mean, come on, it's got Time Stands Still on it. It's a classic. You also got Prime Mover, which is pretty underrated. Same with Second Nature. There's a lot of great stuff on this album. Yeah, it's not one of Rush's best, but it's a pretty good album still. Pretty overhated. Next in this list, we got Diver Down by Van Halen. Yeah, definitely an overhated album and pretty underrated, if you ask me anyway. I know that when it comes to the Van Halen fan base, there's a lot of people that say this is the weakest of David Lee Roth's era, which I would not agree with that. I think the worst album with him on vocals is probably A Different Kind of Truth. Now, if you want to just, exclude that and you're only talking about the classic era, the classic era with David Lee Roth, then yeah, I'd probably say that this is the weakest with David Lee Roth when it comes to the early material. But even in saying that, I still think it's a solid album and pretty underrated. Definitely not as bad as some people claim it to be. A lot of great songs on here like Where Have All the Good Times Gone, Secrets, Oh Pretty Woman, Little Guitars, which is probably my favorite song on the album. But yeah, very good album. Definitely overhated. Of course, rest in peace to Eddie Van Halen. Next in the list, now this is actually an album I reviewed recently on the channel. So next up, we got In Flames with their album Sounds of a Playground Fading. Definitely an overhated album. I know there's some people that put this up there as one of In Flames' most weakest albums. Like they put it up there with Siren Charms, Battles, and I the Mask, which this album to me is definitely not as bad as those albums. This album I think is way better than those albums. yeah, pretty underrated album, definitely overhated. It's got a pretty dark sound to it. I just really like the atmosphere to this album. It's pretty cool. There's a lot of great songs on here, like The Puzzle, Fear is the Weakness, Where the Dead Ships Dwell, The Attic, and A New Dawn, which is, I think, one of the most underrated In Flames songs. But yeah, pretty good album. I mean, it's not one of In Flames' best. Obviously, their best work comes from the 90s, their Melodeath era, but Sounds of a Playground Fading, it's a pretty good album. Next, we got Silence in the Snow by Trivium. And like with the other ones, there's some people that would put this at the bottom of their Trivium rankings, but this album, definitely not as bad as some people claim it to be. I think some people don't like this album because, you know, they got rid of the scream vocals on this album, but honestly, who cares about that? That's not something that really bothers me. I mean, even without the scream vocals, it still, for the most part, sounds like a Trivium record. It's still a very good album. There's a lot of great songs on here, like the title track, Until the World Goes Cold, Rise Above the Tides. What else you got on here? Breathe in the Flames. These are pretty good songs. I mean, sure, like with the other ones that I just mentioned on this list, not one of Trivium's best, but it's still a very good album. Matt Heafy, I like his clean vocals. He does sound good on this album. So yeah, this album, Silence in the Snow, it had to make the list. Next, we got Release the Panic by Red. And this album is definitely underrated and kind of overhated too. Now, like with the others, there's some people that say that this is Red's worst album, which I don't agree with. Yeah, it's not one of their best, but this is not their weakest in my opinion. Their weakest to me would actually be their album Gone. But this album is a close second when it comes to their weakest. But this album still isn't as bad as some people claim it to be. This album is definitely different for Red. They definitely experimented on this album, you know, with more electronics and, you know, a lot of different things, you know. But this album is still pretty solid. I mean, I may have some bias when it comes to this album because I did see the band Red live in concert and I saw them on this tour. So maybe there's just a little bit of attachment there, I guess. But this is still a good album for what it is, definitely overhated. Some of my favorite tracks on here would have to be If We Only, So Far Away, and Glass House. The second half of this album is especially very strong. But yeah, of course, Red is a really good hard rock band. So yeah, this album, not one of their best, but it's pretty good. Definitely overhated. Lastly for this list, now this is another album that I didn't really expect to ever make my list, but here it is. So lastly for this list, we got Gore by Deftones. Deftones has really grown up to be one of my favorite bands, definitely an excellent band. And if you're wondering about this, yes, I did open it. I just put the wrapping back on it just to keep the digipack in decent condition. But the album itself is pretty solid. I mean, Deftones, they've never released a bad album. But some of my favorite tracks on here would have to be Prayers, Triangles, and Phantom Bride. Rubicon is pretty good too. It's a really good album. I know some people say this is their worst album, which honestly, I don't know if I would go that far. I mean, I actually really dig this album. I mean, there's really no wrong answers when it comes to Deftones, but yeah, this album had to make the list. So Deftones and their album Gore. Well, there you have it. That is my list of some overhated albums by great bands. Let me know what you guys think. Are there any bands or albums you think I missed for this video? Are there any overhated albums by great bands that you can think of? Feel free to let me know in the comments. So on that note, thanks for watching, have a nice day, and take care.